Hi everyone, welcome to Behind the Lines from the Civil War Monitor. I'm Katie Brackett-Fialka, your host, and today I'm talking with Megan Kate Nelson, who is a writer, historian, and cultural critic. You may have seen some of her work in the New York Times Disunion blog, the Civil War Times, and our very own, the Civil War Monitor. She is also the author of two books. The first is Ruination, Destruction in the American Civil War, and Trembling Earth, A Cultural History of the Okefenokee Swamp. She's currently writing another book entitled Path of the Dead Man, How the West Was Won and Lost During the American Civil War, which is what she's here to talk to us about today. So first of all, Megan, the word West is in your title, and the word West itself has a lot of debate surrounding it. And so could you tell us a little bit about which West we're talking about here and how that might be different from a lot of the scholarship in the past?
Sure, of course. And thank you, Katie, for inviting me to be part of this series. So I think most Civil War historians and students think of the West and the Western theater as the area kind of between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, sort of comprising, Tennessee and Kentucky and Mississippi and Louisiana. I mean, this is the way that military historians have talked about the Western theater, and I think all Civil War historians sort of talk about it. They talk about it as the Western Theater or the Trans-Mississippi West. Mm-hmm. And what I'm talking about, and what a lot of my colleagues are talking about, is the area further west than that, which is the area kind of west of the Mississippi and even possibly kind of west at around the 100th meridian line, which kind of runs through western North Dakota, through Nebraska and Kansas, far western Oklahoma, which was Indian Territory during the 1860s, and West Texas, and then all the way to the Pacific coast. What is interesting about the kind of understanding of the Western theater as this more eastern, southern space is that it completely erases this region west of the Mississippi to the Pacific from our common narrative of the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
If that region is west, then what's west of west, right? The real west, the even more western west. I mean, it makes it hard. And so I am lobbying for us to talk about that region as the Trans-Mississippi or the Mississippi Valley, and then to talk about this area west of the Mississippi as the West, because I think that's how it's understood, certainly in the field of Western history. And I think that's how it's understood in the sort of American popular imagination.
Okay. So why do you think we should be talking more about the West in terms of the Civil War? Why has it been overlooked? Is there a scholarship on it already? Are we adding to a new conversation with this type of scholarship?
Yeah, those are all really, really great questions. I mean, historians have been writing about the West for 50 years, and mostly military historians. Historians have been writing about it. They just have not made it into the common narrative of the war. I mean, when we look at any kind of big synthesis, like the McPherson text or any other kind of textbook, it's like the West is this major part of the conversation in the coming of the war, right? We talk about the Mexican-American War, we talk about the Wilmot Proviso, we talk about Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850, and then in Reconstruction we talk about the West with the Indian Wars and Transcontinental Railroad and industrial mining, and it's like everyone just sort of jumps over the Civil War. It's like the West doesn't exist anymore kind of in the Civil War proper, and that's a really bizarre turn of events. Sort of, why has this area been ignored? Because there's work on it. There are conflicts there. So what actually happened? And I have two theories about this. One is that, for most historians, both military and social historians, all of the action has been in the Eastern Theater. Mm-hmm. Maybe some in the Trans-Mississippi, but mostly in the Eastern Theater. Military historians are most concerned with the big armies, the big battles, the sort of moments on the field that really sent the war in a specific direction. And they believe that these military conflicts in the West had no impact whatsoever. Social historians are concerned with, very broadly, kind of home front issues, right? And then the history of slavery and emancipation. It means something very different to talk about the home front and slavery and emancipation in the West than it does in the East and the sort of North and the South. And I think the other issue is methodological. The sources for this region are difficult to find. They are scattered all over a very large region, which makes it difficult to travel and very expensive to travel to archives and libraries. There aren't as many of them. And then there are American Indian sources, which are oral histories, many of them archived on reservations. And I think historians are a little bit more intimidated by that particular set of sources and think of it as either problematic or inaccessible. And so I think for those two reasons of sort of focus and methodology, the West has just sort of fallen out. So you asked me the question, why do we need to study the Civil War West and really look at the West or look at the war from this region?
Yeah.
I think the West has a lot to offer to both military and to social historians. For military historians, there are all of these really interesting challenges to the armies in the field that are environmental. It's about logistics and supply, and all of that impacts decisions that are made by commanders in the field. So kind of investigating how soldiers adapted to that environment, both regulars and volunteers, and then also how commanders made decisions in this context, I would think would be really fascinating to military historians who are, interested in these questions in the broader sweep of American and even kind of world military history. I also think, environmental history is sort of my subfield, and environmental historians haven't paid much attention to this region either because it's not the most intensively fought over. But obviously here you've got this very challenging environment that both soldiers and civilians have to deal with. So that offers a lot of interesting case studies, I think, for them. For social historians, looking at the West puts the war's racial and ethnic histories into a much broader context, because here we have Hispanic civilians and soldiers whose relationship to the United States, to the Union, to the Confederacy are very different. Also, of course, the large population that no Civil War historians really talk about unless they're in the border region and Indian Territory are the American Indian peoples who are in the West. Most of them did not, unlike in Indian Territory, most of them did not serve directly in Union and Confederate armies unless they served as scouts and spies. What they did do was to totally take advantage of the white man's war, as one would expect they would, as they, and they had been negotiating their own relationship with U.S. military authorities, and before that, the Mexican authorities. And what they saw was suddenly all of these soldiers and civilians on the move. I also think anyone who is interested in diplomacy or the sort of international aspects of the war, we tend to focus on Europe when we think about that, but Mexico was, right there on the border of both the Confederacy and the Union. And it was a supply conduit, and diplomacy with Mexico was very important to both the Union and the Confederacy. And Mexico was having its own inner turmoil during this period. So that's a fascinating border to consider. Any Civil War historians who are interested in kind of how people perceived of the Union and how they perceived of the Confederacy, what those nations meant to them, and how they kind of thought about their future, you have to consider the West in those conceptions, because for both the Union and the Confederacy, the West was the future, right? The West was manifest destiny. It was where they would expand. It was where they envisioned their empire kind of growing and solidifying.
You made some great points, Megan.
I hope I have convinced everybody to study the West.
So if viewers are interested in learning a little bit more about you or about your work, where would you point them?
So I do have a website and a blog. It's megankatenelson.com, and then the blog is Historista. On Historista, I write about a lot of different things. I write some pieces with historical content about ruins or about war or about, Abraham Lincoln. But then I also talk a lot about popular culture, about different trends where we see history kind of in movies and television or commercials or things like that. And then I also have a sort of strong component about academia.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us, Megan. This has been very enlightening.
Yes, well, thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.